so deep, his love made them strong. And they followed the right for Jesus' sake, the whole of that good life's long. And one was a soldier, and one was a priest, and one was slain by a fierce wild beast. And there's not any reason, no, not the least, why I shouldn't be one too. They live not only in ages past,
Oh my goodness, some of the
there are
kisses.
hundreds of thousands still. The world
goodness.
is bright with the joyous saints who love to do Jesus' will.
What?
You can meet them in school or in lanes or at sea, in church or in trains or in shops or at tea. For the saints of God are just folk like me, and I mean to be one.
What do you see? What do you see? Oh, thank you. Hello, and welcome to Something for Kids.
Creates a new personalized playlist for you every week. To hear it, just ask to play my Discovery Mix.
Thank you. Welcome to Something for Kids, storytelling for the young and the young at heart. I'm Father Steve Demuth, Rector of Holy Trinity Church, and this is Emily, who you probably know already, and she just wanted to say hello, right? And give a kiss. Well, many kisses. Mwah. In our first episode of Something for Kids storytelling in the spring, by accident, the dogs started coming in the picture, and I think everybody enjoyed seeing the dogs more than they enjoyed seeing me. So I sometimes get comments, bring the dogs back, and so that's probably part of why they make a cameo. Besides, they like the attention, and they like to be seen and loved and kissed. We are in the midst of a wonderful adventure with Prince Caspian, Book 2 of the Chronicles of Narnia. We read the first book in the series earlier this year, but if you would like to catch up and hear it for yourself, we read the entire The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it's available on our YouTube channel, Historic Holy Trinity Church of Covina, and just look for Something for Kids, and you'll be able to catch up on that wonderful story. Also, if you have a chance, we will sing a song later. I sing a song of the Saints of God, and if you would like to look that up on your electronic device or have mom and dad look it up for you, or if you were part of our Vacation Bible School or Virtual Bible School this past year, it's in your packet. And if you would like us to send you one, just send us an email and we'll be glad to do so. You can send an email to Padre Steve, P-A-D-R-E, Steve, at holytrinitycovina.com. So, where are we? We are in a part of the story where they had blown the magic horn, which called the four Pevensie children back to Narnia, except many, many, many years later. And Prince Caspian blew it when they were in great need. A dwarf was sent to the castle Paravel in case someone showed up that could bring help. And at first he wasn't so sure that they were going to be helpful at all because they seemed like mere children, two older and two younger. Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. But they all proved to the dwarf that indeed they could be helpful. And so now they're rushing back. They're taking a little boat around what now is the island, which has the stone table in the center. And they're going to see if they can get to help the people, the old Narnians, before King Miraz or the usurper King Miraz can come and do more harm. So the title of chapter 9 is What Lucy Saw. Susan and the two boys were bitterly tired with rowing before they rounded the last headland and began the final pull up Glasswater itself. And Lucy's head ached from the long hours of sun and the glare on the water. Even Trumpkin longed for the voyage to be over. The seat on which he sat to steer had been made for men, not dwarfs, and his feet did not reach the floorboards, and everyone knows how uncomfortable it is even for 10 minutes. And as they all grew more tired, their spirits fell. Up till now, the children had only been thinking of how to get to Caspian. Now they wondered what they would do when they found him, and how a handful of dwarfs and woodland creatures could defeat an army of grown-up humans. Twilight was coming on as they rowed slowly up the winding of Glasswater Creek, a twilight which deepened as the banks drew closer together and the overhanging trees began almost to meet overhead. It was very quiet in here as the sound of the sea died away behind them. They could even hear the trickle of the little streams that poured down from the forest into Glasswater. They went ashore at last, far too tired to attempt lighting a fire, and even a supper of apples, though most of them felt that they never wanted to see an apple again. Seemed better than trying to catch or shoot anything. After a little silent munching, they all huddled down together in the moss and dead leaves between the 4 large birch trees. Everyone except Lucy went to sleep at once. Lucy, being far less tired, found it hard to get comfortable. Also, she had forgotten till now that all dwarfs snore. She knew that one of the best ways of getting to sleep is to stop trying. So she opened her eyes. Through a gap in the bracken and branches, she could see just a patch of water in the creek and the sky above it. Then, with a thrill of memory, she saw again, after all those years, the bright Narnian stars. She had once known them better than the stars of her own world, because as a queen in Narnia, she had gone to bed much later than as a child in England. And there they were at last. At least 3 of the summer constellations could be seen from where she lay: the ship, the hammer, and the leopard. Dear old leopard, she murmured happily to herself. Instead of getting drowsier, she was getting more awake, with an odd, nighttime, dreamish kind of wakefulness. The creek was growing brighter. She knew now that the moon was on it, though she couldn't see the moon. And now she began to feel that the whole forest was coming awake like herself. Hardly knowing why she did it, she got up quickly and walked a little distance away from their bivouac. "This is lovely," said Lucy to herself. It was cool and fresh. Delicious smells were floating everywhere. Somewhere close at hand, she heard the twitter of a nightingale beginning to sing, then stopping, then beginning again. It was a little lighter ahead. She went towards the light and came to a place where there were fewer trees and whole patches or pools of moonlight. But the moonlight and the shadows so mixed that you could hardly be sure where anything was or what it was. At the same moment, the nightingale, satisfied at last with his tuning up, burst into full song. Lucy's eyes began to grow accustomed to the light, and she saw the trees that were nearest her more distinctly. A great longing for the old days when the trees could talk in Narnia came over her. She knew exactly how each of these trees would talk if only she could wake them, and what sort of human form it would put on. She looked at a silver birch. It would have a soft, showery voice and would look like a slender girl, with hair blown all about her face and fond of dancing. She looked at the oak. He would be a wizened but hearty old man with a frizzled beard and warts on his face and hands and hair growing out of the warts. She looked at the beech under which she was standing. Ah, she would be the best of all. She would be a gracious goddess, smooth and stately, the lady of the wood. "Oh, trees, trees, trees," said Lucy, though she had not been intending to speak at all. "Oh, trees, wake, wake, wake! Don't you remember it? Don't you remember me? Dryads and hamadryads, come out, come to me." Though there was not a breath of wind, they all stirred about her. The rustling noise of the leaves was almost like words. The nightingale stopped singing as if to listen to it. Lucy felt that at any moment she would begin to understand what the trees were trying to say, but the moment did not come. The rustling died away. The nightingale resumed its song. Even in the moonlight, the wood looked more ordinary again. Yet Lucy had the feeling, as you sometimes have when you are trying to remember a name or a date and almost get it, but it vanishes before you really do, that she had just missed something, as if she had spoken to the trees a split second too soon, or a split second too late, or used all the right words except one, or put in one word that was just wrong. Quite suddenly, she began to feel tired. She went back to the bivouac, snuggled down between Susan and Peter, and was asleep in a few moments. It was a cold and cheerless waking for them all next morning, with a gray twilight in the wood, for the sun had not risen, and everything damp and dirty. "Apples, hey-ho," said Trumpkin with a rueful grin. "I must say you ancient kings and queens don't overfeed your courtiers." They stood up and shook themselves and looked about. The trees were thick, and they could no more see than a few yards in any direction. "I suppose your majesties know the way all right," said the dwarf. "I don't," said Susan. "I've never seen these woods in my life before. In fact, I thought all along that we ought to have gone by the river." "Then I think you might have said so at the time," answered Peter, with pardonable sharpness. "Oh, don't take any notice of her," said Edmund. "She's always a wet blanket." "You've got that pocket compass of yours, Peter, haven't you? Well then, we're right as rain. We've only got to keep on going northwest, cross that little river, what you call it, the Rush." "I know," said Peter. "The one that joins the big river at the fords of Baruna, or Baruna's Bridge, as the DLF calls it." "That's right. Cross it and strike uphill, and we'll be at the stone table, Aslan's How, I mean, by 8 or 9 o'clock. I hope King Caspian will give us a good breakfast." "I hope you're right," said Susan. "I can't remember that at all." "That's the worst of girls," said Edmund to Peter. And the dwarf, "They never can carry a map in their heads." "That's because our heads have something inside them," said Lucy. At first, these things seemed to be going pretty well. They even thought that they had struck an old path. But if you know anything about woods, you will know that one is always finding imaginary paths. They disappear after about 5 minutes, and then you think you have found another and hope it is not another but more of the same one. And it also disappears. And after you have been well lured out of your right direction, you realize that none of them were paths at all. The boys and the dwarf, however, were used to woods and were not taken in for more than a few seconds. They had plodded on for about half an hour, 3 of them very stiff from yesterday's rowing, when Trumpkin suddenly whispered, "Stop!" They all stopped. "There's something following us," he said in a low voice, "or rather, something keeping up with us, over there on the left." They all stood still, listening and staring till their ears and eyes ached. "You and I better each have an arrow on the string," said Susan to Trumpkin. The dwarf nodded, and when both bows were ready for action, the party went on. They went a few dozen yards through fairly open woodland, keeping a sharp lookout. Then they came to a place where the undergrowth thickened, and they had to pass nearer to it. Just as they were passing the place, there came a sudden something that snarled and flashed, rising out from the breaking twigs like a thunderbolt. Lucy was knocked down and winded, hearing the twang of a bowstring as she fell. When she was able to take notice of things again, she saw a great grim-looking gray bear lying dead with Trumpkin's arrow in its side. "The DLF beat you in that shooting match, Sue," said Peter with a slightly forced smile. Even he had been shaken by this adventure. I left it too late," said Susan, in an embarrassed voice. "I was so afraid it might be, one of our kind of bears, a talking bear." She hated killing things. "That's the trouble of it," said Trumpkin, "when most of the beasts have gone enemy and gone dumb, but there are still some of the other kind left. You never know, and you daren't wait to see." "Poor old Bruin," said Susan. "You don't think he was—" "Not he," said the dwarf. "I saw the face, and I heard the snarl. He only wanted little girl for his breakfast. And talking of breakfast, I didn't want to discourage your majesties when you said you hoped King Caspian would give you a good one, but meat's precious scarce in camp, and there's good eating on a bear. It would be a shame to leave the carcass without taking a bit, and it won't delay us more than half an hour. I dare say you 2 youngsters, kings I should say, know how to skin a bear?" "Let's go and sit down a fair way off," said Susan to Lucy. "I know what a horrid messy business that will be." Lucy shuddered and nodded. When they had sat down, she said, "Such a horrible idea has come into my mind, Sue." "What's that?" "Wouldn't it be dreadful if some day in our own world at home, men started going wild inside, like the animals here, and still looked like men, so that you'd never know which were which?" "We've got enough to bother about here and now in Narnia," said the practical Susan, without imagining things like that. When they rejoined the boys and the dwarf, as much as they thought they could carry of the beast meat they had been cut off, they carried. Raw meat is not a nice thing to fill one's pockets with, but they folded it up in fresh leaves and made the best of it. They were all experienced enough to know that they would feel quite differently about these squashy and unpleasant parcels when they had walked long enough to be really hungry. On they trudged again, stopping to wash 3 pairs of hands that needed it in the first stream that they passed, until the sun rose and the birds began to sing, and more flies than they wanted were buzzing in the bracken. The stiffness from yesterday's rowing began to wear off. Everybody's spirits rose. The sun grew warmer, and they took their helmets off and carried them. "I suppose we are going right," said Edmund about an hour later. "I don't see how we can be going wrong as long as we don't bear too much to the left," said Peter. "If we bear too much to the right, the worst that can happen is wasting a little time by striking the great river too soon and not cutting off the corner." And again they trudged on with no sound except the thud of their feet and the jingle of their chain shirts. "Where's this Ballyrush got to?" said Edmund a good deal later. "I certainly thought we'd have struck it by now," said Peter, "but there's nothing to do but keep on." They both knew that the dwarf was looking anxiously at them, but it said nothing. And still they trudged on, and their mail shirts began to feel very hot and heavy. "What on earth?" said Peter suddenly. They had come, without seeing it, almost to the edge of a small precipice, from which they looked down into a gorge with a river at the bottom. On the far side, the cliffs rose much higher. None of the party except Edmund and perhaps Trumpkin was a rock climber. "I'm sorry," said Peter. "It's my fault for coming this way. We're lost. I've never seen this place in my life before." The dwarf gave a low whistle between its teeth. "Oh, do let's go back and go the other way," said Susan. "I knew all along we'd get lost in these woods." "Susan," said Lucy reproachfully, "don't nag at Peter like that. It's so rotten, and he's doing all he can." "And don't you snap at Sue like that either," said Edmund. "I think she's quite right." "Tubs and tortoise-shells," exclaimed Trumpkin. "If we've got lost coming, what chance have we of finding our way back? And if we're to go back to the island and begin all over again, even supposing we could, we might as well give up the whole thing. Miraz will have finished with Caspian before we get there at that rate." "You think we ought to go on?" said Lucy. "I'm not sure that High King is lost," said Trumpkin. "What's to hinder this river being the Rush?" "Because the Rush is not in a gorge," said Peter, keeping his temper with some difficulty. "Your Majesty says is," replied the dwarf. "But oughtn't you to say was? You knew this country hundreds, it may be 1,000 years ago. Mayn't it have changed? A landslide might have pulled off half the side of that hill, leaving bare rock. And there are your precious precipices beyond the gorge. Then the Rush might go on and deepening its course year after year until you get that little precipice on this side, or there might have been an earthquake or anything." "I never thought of that," said Peter. "And anyway," continued Trumpkin, "even if this is not the Rush, it's flowing roughly north, and so it must fall into the great river anyway. I think I passed something that might have been it on the way down. So if we go downstream to our right, we'll hit the great river. Perhaps not so high as we'd hoped, but at least we'll be no worse off than if you come my way." "Trumpkin, you're a brick," said Peter. Come on, Hen. Down this side of the gorge." "Look, look, look!" cried Lucy. "Where? What?" asked everyone. "The lion," said Lucy. "Aslan himself. Didn't you see?" Her face had changed completely, and her eyes shone. "Do you really mean?" began Peter. "Where did you think you saw him?" asked Susan. "Don't talk like a grown-up," said Lucy, stamping her foot. "I didn't think I saw him. I saw him." "Where, Lou?" asked Peter. "Right up there between the mountain ashes." "No, this side of the gorge, and up, not down, just the opposite of the way you want to go. And he wanted us to go where he was, up there. How do you know that was what he wanted? Asked Edmund. Yeah, I just know, said Lucy, by his face. The others all looked at each other in puzzled silence. Her Majesty may well have seen a lion, put in Trumpkin. There are lions in these woods, I've been told, but it needn't have been a friendly and talking lion any more than the bear was a friendly and talking bear. Oh, don't be so stupid, said Lucy. Do you think I don't know Aslan when I see him? He'd be a pretty elderly lion by now, said Trumpkin, if he's one you knew when you were here before. And if it could be the same one, what's to prevent him from having gone wild and witless like so many others? Lucy turned crimson, and I think she would have flown at Trumpkin if Peter had not laid his hand on her arm. The DLF does not understand. How could he? You must just take it, Trumpkin, that we really do know about Aslan. A little bit about him, I mean. And you mustn't talk about him like that again. It isn't lucky for one thing, and it's all nonsense for another. The only question is whether Aslan was really there. But I know he was, said Lucy, her eyes filling with tears. Yes, Lou, but we don't, you see, said Peter. There's nothing for it but a vote, said Edmund. All right, replied Peter. You're the eldest, DLF. What do you vote for, up or down? Down, said the dwarf. I know nothing about Aslan, but I do know that if we turn left and follow the gorge up, it might lead us all the way before we found a place where we could cross it. Whereas, if we turn right and go down, we're bound to reach the great river in about a couple hours. And if there are any real lions about, we want to go away from them, not towards them. What do you say, Susan? Don't be angry, Lou, said Susan, but I do think we should go down. I'm dead tired. Do let's get out of this wretched wood into the open as quick as we can, and none of us except you saw anything. Edmund? Said Peter. Well, there's just this, said Edmund, speaking quickly and turning a little red. When we first discovered Narnia a year ago, or 1,000 years ago, whichever it is, it was Lucy who discovered it first, and none of us would believe her. I was the worst of the lot, I know. Yet she was right after all. Wouldn't it be fair to believe her this time? I vote for going up. Oh, Ed, said Lucy, and seized his hand. And now it's your turn, Peter, said Susan, and I do hope... Oh, shut up, and let a chap think, interrupted Peter. I'd much rather not have to vote. You're the High King, said Trumpkin sternly. Down, said Peter after a long pause. I know Lucy may be right after all, but I can't help it. We must do one or the other. So they set off to their right along the edge, downstream, and Lucy came at last of the party, crying bitterly. And here ends the chapter called What Lucy Saw. So I have a question for you. Should they have gone up, like Lucy imagined Aslan to be directing them, or should they go down, hoping to get to the great river so they can get to Prince Caspian as soon as possible? How would you have voted? Maybe you can write, I would vote up, or I vote down in the comments and let us know what you think. Do you think Lucy saw Aslan after all? Or do you think she may have been mixed up and just saw a shadow, or perhaps any old lion? If it was up to me, I think I would vote going up. But that's too late anyway. Lucy got outvoted and they decided to go down. Tomorrow, we'll find out whether that was the right decision or not. Let's sing our song, and I hope you have the lyrics before you so you can sing along. I sing a song of the saints of God, patient and brave and true, who toiled and fought and lived and died for the Lord they loved and knew. And one was a doctor, and one was a queen, and one was a shepherdess on the green. They were all of them saints of God, and I mean God helping to be one too. They loved their Lord so dear, and God's love made them strong. They followed the right for Jesus' sake, the whole of their good lives long. And one was a soldier, and one was a priest, and one was slain by a fierce wild beast. And there's not any reason, no, not the least, why I shouldn't be one too. They lived not only in ages past, there are hundreds of thousands still. The world is bright with the joyous saints who love to do Jesus' will. You can meet them in school, or in lanes, or at sea, or in church, or in trains, or in shops, or at tea. For the saints of God are just folk like me, and I mean to be one too. Thank you for singing the song, and I hope you enjoy it. A saint is someone who lives by the law of love, and I hope we can all try to live that way and know Jesus' love and share Jesus' love. And I hope you're enjoying our book. We are more than halfway through, and tomorrow, do you want to know the title of the chapter? Chapter 10, The Return of the Lion. Boy, I just might have given it away. Perhaps Lucy was right, but we'll find out more tomorrow. So before we say goodnight, I thought we could say an evening prayer. And you know how we do it. I say, the Lord be with you, and you respond it also with you. So let's try that. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Dear God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the wonderful story we are reading. And we thank you for the lessons it teaches, that we should learn to trust those who are truthful, that we should depend upon people who are known to be dependable, and that being truthful and being dependable are attributes of good people. Help us to be good, Lord. Help us to love, and help us to trust and follow you closely. Bless our families, our moms and our dads, our grandmothers and grandparents, for our cousins and sisters and brothers and friends and neighbors, for our church community, and for all those reading this book together now online, for this house, for Paco, for our 3 dogs, Emily, Temek, and Manzanita, for our roommate Paul, and for this community and for this nation and the world. For those who are sick, Lord, bring healing. For those who are sad, Lord, comfort them. And for those who are happy, preserve them. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for sharing this adventure with us. I can't wait to hear tomorrow about the return of the lion. I hope you're excited too. And until then, good night and God bless.